distracts from the urgent needs to address Yemen's own international crisis. Yemenis continue to yearn and work for peace after more than 9 years of conflict, which has ravaged the country, displaced millions, separated families and shattered the economy. And yet they see their space for meaningful engagement and peace building under attack, with arbitrary detentions, death threats and intimidation, especially in Ansar Allah-controlled areas. I call on Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained, including 17 United Nations personnel, 4 of whom are women and 1 of whom is from my own team, and to end their campaign of detentions. I am counting on the support of this Council in sending this clear message. Madam President, I recently spoke with several civil society organizations, women's groups, activists and local peacemakers. And they told me how deeply they have been affected by the latest wave of Ansar Allah arbitrary detentions. These detentions, compounded by vague and false accusations and the total lack of any due process, aim to tarnish reputations and create a climate of fear and mistrust. The latest reported referral of some of the detained to so-called criminal prosecution is a further blow to our collective efforts to build peace and stability in Yemen. I have repeatedly told Ansar Allah these kinds of actions do not signal an interest in negotiating peace. Civil society actors and human rights defenders continue to play a critical role in addressing the urgent humanitarian needs and fostering social cohesion. They deserve strong protection measures and international support to continue their work safely. Madam President, since my last briefing to this Council, I have engaged in constructive discussions with Yemeni and international stakeholders during visits to New York, to Tehran and to Moscow. In addition to requesting support for the release of the detained, my engagements have reaffirmed 2 critical messages that I wish to share to this Council. First, a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Yemen is not only the most viable way forward, but more importantly, it is definitely achievable. Second, the Yemeni people require sustained and unified international support, and we must collectively keep the focus on making peace a reality. These are not just mere aspirations. We have the elements and the tools to prepare the ground, and allow me therefore to elaborate. First, we have the commitments made by the parties towards the establishment of a roadmap, including a nationwide ceasefire, addressing humanitarian and economic needs, and preparing for an inclusive political process. Despite the escalation, these commitments remain the essential building blocks for peace in Yemen, and the reference points for our discussions with the parties. In support of such discussions, this month, my office initiated political dialogue sessions with Yemeni political party representatives and components, as well as civil society organizations with a meaningful participation of women and youth. Second, on the military front, we have relative calm on the front lines, despite occasional flare-ups that remind us of the fragility of this situation. Communication channels with senior military leadership through the Military Coordination Committee remain active, reinforcing the message that the groundwork laid now will be critical to ensuring the stability of a future ceasefire and other security arrangements. Recently, we hosted a delegation from the government of Yemen to plan and prepare for the nationwide ceasefire mechanism, and we hope to hold additional sessions with Ansar Allah and other relevant partners soon. Third, on the economic front, we have identified options at the technical level and are working to convince the parties that collaboration on economic issues is the only way to achieve economic viability and stability. We remain in close contact with key stakeholders, particularly in the banking sector, where the potential collapse of a major commercial bank highlights the urgent need for cooperation. Madam President, let me be clear. The tools are there, and I call on the parties to demonstrate the necessary will and to put the needs of Yemenis first. I am, in this regard, looking forward to the briefing of Dr. Najat Juman. Madam President, as we mark the anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, we must acknowledge the immense burden Yemeni women continue to carry in this conflict and recognize their bravery. Yemeni women have been at the forefront in driving peace-building efforts for years, and now more than ever it is crucial to amplify their voices. I call on all parties to ensure that women are empowered to shape the decisions that will pave the way for lasting peace in Yemen. To support this, my office, in partnership with UN Women, have to date held specific consultations with over 400 Yemeni women and men to advance a vision for an inclusive peace process in Yemen. The consultations aim to achieve the meaningful inclusion of women in negotiations and to lay the foundations for more inclusive and sustainable peace. These efforts reinforce our commitment to enhancing women's direct participation across all tracks of the peace process. Madam President, my office remains steadfast in pursuing every opportunity for peace in Yemen. The parties must demonstrate their commitments to peace through meaningful actions, including the immediate release of all arbitrarily detained. The need for unity and purpose in and on Yemen has never been greater. I want to underscore again that despite the broader regional conflict, peace in Yemen is still achievable, and we must remain focused on making this a reality. This Council carries the hopes of the global community that conflicts can be resolved through international collaboration and diplomacy. As Special Envoy for Yemen, I convey the expectations of the Yemeni people and urge this Council to unite in stopping the bloodshed and supporting every effort to bring peace to a region in desperate need of it. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Je remercie M. Grundberg de son exposé et je donne à présent la parole à Mme Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grundberg, for his briefing and tireless efforts on behalf of the people of Yemen. Madam President, I would like to start once again by demanding the immediate and unconditional release of the UN personnel, NGO staff, and members of civil society arbitrarily detained by the Houthis since June this year, as well as our UN colleagues detained since 2021 and 2023. We categorically reject the allegations leveled against our colleagues. United Nations personnel should never be arrested or detained because of the work they do in carrying out our mandate. As such, I echo the extreme concern expressed by the principals of affected organizations in a statement on Saturday, 12th of October, about the reported referral to criminal prosecution by the Houthis de facto authorities of a significant number of arbitrarily detained colleagues, including 3 United Nations personnel, 2 from UNESCO and 1 from the UN Human Rights Office, who were detained in 2021 and 2023. The potential laying of charges against our colleagues is unacceptable. The arbitrary detention of humanitarian personnel and the false accusations against them continue to significantly hinder our ability to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance in Yemen. The detentions are reflective of a growing unacceptable pattern of attacks against humanitarians across the region. Humanitarian relief personnel must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, throughout the past month, the UN has engaged in continuous diplomatic efforts with the Houthi de facto authorities and other interlocutors for the release of those arbitrarily detained, including during high-level week of the General Assembly. I am thankful for the strong support we have received from member states, including key countries in the region. Additionally, we greatly welcome the commitment by member states and donors to continue to support humanitarian assistance across Yemen. As of today, because of continued advocacy, we have confirmed that a majority of the detained UN staff have had contact with their families or relatives. Those requiring health care have received it. We continue to stress that our colleagues must be treated humanely and with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, including in regard to judicial guarantees as applicable. Madam President, let me also take this opportunity to extend my condolences to the families of at least 48 migrants who recently lost their lives off the coast of Djibouti. We understand they were returning from Yemen to Djibouti when they were forced off their vessel in open sea by smugglers. According to our colleagues at the International Organization for Migration, 57 other people who were on board remain missing. The UN is supporting authorities in Djibouti with search and rescue operations. To date, 197 people have been rescued and are receiving medical and psychosocial support. 2024 now marks the deadliest year for migrants crossing the sea between the Horn of Africa and Yemen. This incident is a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers along such migration routes. Ultimately, these are challenges that require regional solutions. Madam President, we are deeply concerned about the impact on Yemen's humanitarian crisis of the rapidly deteriorating situation across the Middle East. We are very alarmed by the ongoing attacks from and on Yemen, which has damaged critical infrastructure, including energy and port infrastructure in Hodeidah and Ras Issa. Both ports remain operational and able to receive commercial and humanitarian imports. Power stations throughout Hodeidah city are, however, running at very limited capacity. In response, the UN is providing support to health facilities to ensure the continuation of essential services. We recall that all parties must respect their obligations under international law and reiterate the Secretary General's calls for utmost restraint and for all concerned to avoid attacks that could harm civilians and damage civilian infrastructure. Infrastructure that is indispensable to the survival of the population must be spared. Yemen's Red Sea ports are lifelines for millions of people across the country. It is paramount that they remain open and operational. Madam President, against a backdrop of regional escalation, the humanitarian situation in Yemen continues to worsen, both in scale and severity. Hunger continues to rise. In August, the number of people who do not have enough food to eat soared to unprecedented levels, and severe levels of food deprivation have doubled in areas controlled by the Houthi de facto authorities since last year. Cholera also continues to spread. Since March this year, more than 203,000 suspected cases have been reported, and more than 720 people have lost their lives. Women and girls account for 53% of cases. Partners expect cases to double between now and March 2025. The humanitarian community remains determined to deliver at scale for the 18.2 million people in need. I want to take this opportunity to thank member states and the donor community for their ongoing generous support for the humanitarian response in Yemen. Currently, the humanitarian appeal for Yemen is 41% funded. However, critical response sectors need urgent additional funding. The food security sector quickly needs an additional $870 million. Without this, an estimated 9 million people across Yemen will not receive emergency food aid in the last quarter of 2024. Women and children, IDPs, and other marginalized groups will bear the brunt of the resultant spread of hunger, including heightened protection risks and long-term health consequences. Funding for the cholera response has already run out. Health partners have been forced to close 21 out of 75 diarrhea treatment centers and 97 out of 423 oral rehydration centers. It is estimated that 70% of the remaining diarrhea treatment centers and 42% of the remaining oral rehydration centers will close by December if urgent funding is not received. Long-term funding for gender-based violence programs is also a critical requirement. This is a sector that remains chronically underfunded, with deep lasting impacts on women and girls' safety, dignity, and mental health. Madam President, for too long, civilians in Yemen have suffered because of factors beyond their control. They have endured a devastating decade-long conflict which has upended livelihoods, decimated Yemen's economy, and driven millions of people into poverty and despair. Now, like many in the Middle East, their hopes for a brighter future are falling under the shadow of potentially catastrophic regional conflagration. The only way out is a redoubling efforts for a sustainable peace. I once commend Special Envoy Grundberg for his steadfast efforts in this regard, and I urge member states to do everything they can to support him and to push for the resumption of the peace process and an urgent de-escalation across the region. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame Souya de son exposé. Je donne à présent la parole à Madame Najat Tuman.
السيدة الرئيسة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا سيدتي الرئيسة على استدعائي لإلقاء كلمتي في مجلس الأمن واهتمام مجلس الأمن بسماع صوت القطاع الخاص في اليمن. كما أشكركم جميعا على شرف الدعوة وعلى اهتمامكم بالاستماع للأصوات اليمنية. إن هذا فعلا أمر مهم، خاصة إن التطورات الأخيرة في اليمن تؤكد أنه قد حان الوقت ليكون هناك مكانة حقيقية لصوت اليمنيين الذين يتوقون للسلام ولصياغة مستقبل بلادهم لكي يكون لها مكانة في تحقيق الرفاهية الإنسانية لجميع اليمنيين. سيدتي الرئيسة أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، بدأت الحرب في اليمن منذ عدد من السنوات، وتوالت الأحداث بشكل سريع ومعقد مما خلق بيئة أعمال مضطربة ومعقدة وشديدة التغيير أثرت على أداء القطاع الخاص بشكل خاص وعلى الاقتصاد بشكل عام. ثم تلتها فترة أخرى من الصراع بأدوات اقتصادية مختلفة ومعقدة، وفي هذه المرحلة تم استخدام أدوات حرب أكثر قوة وفتاكة من حيث التأثير والدمار الاقتصادي والمعنوي لليمنيين. الحرب في اليمن كان لها أثر كبير على الاقتصاد، ففي فترة الحرب المسلحة تضرر القطاع الخاص بشكل مباشر، حيث تعرضت منشآته للدمار، منها المصانع والمخازن وقاطرات نقل البضائع بين المدن، تعرضت لقصف مباشر ما أدى إلى تدميرها وتحقيق خسائر مالية وبشرية واقتصادية جسيمة. مع ذلك استمر القطاع الخاص في القيام بدوره الوطني والاجتماعي والإنساني والاقتصادي، كما استمر في البقاء على موظفيه ودفع الرواتب إلى جانب قيامه بالمسؤولية المجتمعية من خلال تقديم المال والدعم للمتضررين، مع أن الأنشطة الاقتصادية في بداية الحرب منها تأثر وآخر توقف تماما. وفي المرحلة الثانية من الحرب فإن أدوات الحرب الاقتصادية التي تم استخدامها وهي أشد فترا وتأثيرا على الاقتصاد، حيث أن انقسام المؤسسات السيادية كان واضحا في سلطات البنك المركزي، وزارة المالية، وزارة الاتصالات، وشركة الطيران اليمنية، وكان واضحا أيضا في انقسام السياسات النقدية وارتفاع أسعار الصرف في العملات الأجنبية وانقسام السلطة المالية وتعدد الضرائب وازدواجها، وكذلك تضاعف الجمارك. كما أثرت الأزمة في عام 2024 على البنوك البنوك اليمنية التجارية والإسلامية وبنوك التمويل الأصغر، كل ذلك ساهم في ارتفاع تكاليف منح الاعتمادات وامتناع المؤسسات المالية الدولية التعامل مع البنوك اليمنية، كما حجمت الشركات العالمية الكبرى على التعامل مع القطاع الخاص. كما هاجرت رؤوس الأموال والعقول البشرية وهاجر الشباب والعمالة الماهرة من أطباء ومهندسين وأساتذة الجامعات، كما قام كثير من أصحاب رؤوس الأموال بتصفية أعمالهم لحماية رؤوس أموالهم من التآكل وإعادة استثمارها في الخارج بما يحرم المجتمع من هذه الثروة في عملية التنمية. ومن هذه التحديات أيضا تعقيد عملية النقل بين المدن الرئيسية بسبب القيود المفروضة على الحركة، ومن خلال إقفال الطرقات الرئيسية والتي تعتبر هامة للتجارة الداخلية وتنقل البضائع والمواطنين بين المدن والقرى اليمنية. كما خلق اقتصاد حرب
transportation between the major population centers, and this is a challenge because the infrastructure was destroyed and the roads had been closed. And this led to a war economy, and the benefits from that are in the hands of the armed groups, and this deprives the Yemeni people of a better future. There is also an international conflict going on in the Red Sea, and this creates a very difficult economic environment, very difficult for the private sector. This led to the rise in the cost of maritime transport and international transport, which in turn led to the rise in the cost of goods and pushed the private sector and international investors to refrain from investing in my country. We were therefore seriously damaged in this international conflict, where we are trying to see a peaceful horizon here. Countries have a reaction to what is going on in the Red Sea and attacks Yemen. We have to find a solution within the United Nations, led by the efforts made by the Special Envoy Hans Grundberg on that. And we need to make sure that there is peace and stability in Yemen for the Yemeni people. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express the following recommendations. Urge the Yemeni parties and international communities to support the efforts that are being made by Mr. Grundberg. Urge the United Nations to continue their efforts within the framework of July 2024 so as to attain economic stability more broadly. Urge those who are working for peace and the Special Envoy to continue with their efforts together with the civil society and to enable the reopening of various roads. Urge the parties and the international community to include all of the parties involved in the peace process, the young people in particular, and the women,
القوة والسلطة دون التركيز على جماعات
as well
على
as
حساب
to
جماعات
have a more equitable distribution of
الدول
wealth.
الراعية للسلام والأمم المتحدة في دعم المؤسسات اليمنية
Those
التي
who work
تسعى
for peace
لتحقيق
and the
السلام في
United
اليمن
Nations to
من خلال
support the
تطوير برامج
Yemeni
لزيادة مشاركتها
institutions
وفعاليتها في القطاعات الاقتصادية
by
والاجتماعية
promoting
والإنسانية
the
بما يعزز
participation of
تحقيق
all
واستمرار
Yemeni
السلام.
stakeholders
حتى المجتمع الدولي في
in
دعم اليمن في
economic and
الحصول على
social
الأموال
humanitarian
اللازمة
sectors.
وإدارة
Urge the
الموارد المالية
international community
العامة
to support the Yemeni
وذلك لدفع
people
الرواتب وتمويل تقديم
and
الخدمات الأساسية والاستثمار في البنية
their
التحتية
funds so
والتدريب
that
المهني
salaries
والبدء
can
في
be
عملية
paid
التعافي
and
والإعمار
invest in
في اليمن.
infrastructure
حتى
and
المجتمع
training
الدولي
in
في
Yemen.
مساعدة اليمن على حشد
And
الموارد المالية
finally,
اللازمة
urge and encourage the
للتعافي
international
وإعادة
community to
الإعمار
help Yemen so
كعوامل
as to
أساسية للتنمية
mobilize the
الاقتصادية
funding
بحيث
that we
يكون
need
القطاع
for
الخاص
recovery
ومؤسساته
and
جزءا من عملية إعادة
reconstruction.
الإعمار والبناء
The private sector will
وإنشاء صندوق
participate
إعادة
in
الإعمار
this
بهدف
and finally
يهدف
create
إلى
a
حشد وتخصيص
recovery
هذه
and
الأموال في
reconstruction fund
المشاريع
so as to
التنموية.
mobilize the
شكرا سيدتي
finance for development projects. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie Madame
I
Jouman
thank
de son
Ms.
exposé.
Jouman for her briefing.
Et je donne maintenant la parole
I
aux membres
now
du
give
Conseil
the
qui
floor
souhaitent
to
faire une
those council members
déclaration.
who wish to make
Je
statements.
passe la parole à la
I give the
représentante
floor
permanente
to
du
the
Royaume-Uni.
permanent representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Grundberg, Acting Under-Secretary-General Masuya, and Professor Jouman for your briefings and for your work for peace. I'll make 3 points. I want to start by highlighting the pressing humanitarian need across all of Yemen, as our briefers have already done. Unimpeded humanitarian access is vital to deliver critical life-saving assistance to Yemenis. It is crucial that all humanitarian, UN and diplomatic staff are free from intimidation and threats in order to operate safely and securely. It follows that the detention of aid workers by the Houthis, which has continued for 130 days, and we now understand these detainees may face a so-called judicial process. The use of special political courts will not result in fair outcomes for the detainees. So we call again on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release those detained and provide an adequate operating environment for humanitarians. We call on the international community to stand united in calling for the immediate release of those detained. Second, as an import-dependent country, commercial imports are critical to the livelihoods of the Yemeni population. The import of weapons by the Houthis, in violation of the arms embargo, risks undermining the ability of humanitarian and commercial entities to import goods. This once again demonstrates the Houthis' clear disregard for the well-being of the Yemeni people. UNVIM is key, UNVIM is key to facilitating these vital imports. We urge international donors to work together to provide adequate and predictable funding to strengthen UNVIM's inspection capacity and ability to prevent the flow of weapons. Finally, we call upon the Houthis to avoid dragging Yemen into a regional conflict through its continued attacks against Israel. It is vital that we bring to an end this cycle of violence and that the Houthis prioritize the needs of the Yemeni people. I reiterate the UK's call for urgent regional de-escalation and progress towards sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of members of the A3+, namely Algeria, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and my own country, Guyana. We join other colleagues in thanking Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Acting USG Joyce Msuya for their valuable briefings and take note of the contribution of Professor Juman on the situation in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of Yemen in this meeting. Madam President, as highlighted by the briefers, the humanitarian situation in Yemen remains dire, with the country enduring one of the most devastating crises in recent history. The arbitrary detention of UN staff and other humanitarian workers by the Houthis, a clear violation of international humanitarian law, has also impeded the humanitarian response to the detriment of the Yemeni people. The A3+ echoes the recent appeal of the Secretary General, as well as the principles of the affected United Nations agencies, for the release of all arbitrarily detained personnel in Yemen. Their freedom is essential for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance and the pursuit of peace in Yemen. We are alarmed by the reported referral to criminal prosecution by the Houthi de facto authorities of a significant number of arbitrarily detained aid workers, including 3 United Nations personnel who were detained in 2021 and 2023, and renew our call for their immediate release and for full respect for their human rights. We deplore this unacceptable behavior and emphasize the need for humanitarian personnel to be allowed to operate without fear or obstruction. We further urge the Houthis to desist from further actions that impede efforts to provide humanitarian aid and protection to the millions of Yemenis in need, and to instead direct their attention to advancing the peace process. Madam President, after a decade of conflict, the Yemen peace process remains in a state of limbo, a product of a mutually hurting stalemate, the misaligned expectations among internal and external stakeholders, and shifting regional dynamics. All the while, it is the Yemeni people who continue to pay the ultimate price. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is considered one of the most severe and complex in the world due to the scale of human suffering, the protracted nature of the conflict, counterproductive actions, and the geopolitical complexities that impede political progress. We reaffirm the urgent need for a Yemeni-led political and peace process, as advocated for by UN Special Envoy, to facilitate a peaceful and inclusive transition. We urge the conflict parties and regional and other stakeholders to refrain from actions that would deepen divisions or hinder dialogue. The A3+ acknowledges the significant diplomatic efforts undertaken by Mr. Grundberg, who has made strides in re-engaging regional actors and ensuring that Yemeni political voices are included in the peace process. His message throughout this process has been clear. Achieving peace in Yemen requires unified efforts from all stakeholders, both regionally and globally. Recent Israeli airstrikes on Houthi-controlled infrastructure represent a troubling escalation of regional tensions, raising the potential for a wider conflict that threatens the stability of the entire Middle East. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea jeopardize the active maritime ecosystem in the Red Sea and continue to pose a threat to commercial activities. This vital maritime corridor for global trade has become increasingly unstable, driving up transportation costs and disrupting food and fuel supplies, not only for Yemen, but for the entire region. Maritime security is essential for global trade. The Houthis must cease these hostile operations immediately. The A3+ emphasizes the urgent need to secure these maritime routes and safeguard global commerce. We call on the Houthis to cease all attacks, which undermine navigational rights and freedoms. Considering these challenges, the A3+ firmly maintains that securing an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza is a critical first step towards lasting peace throughout the region. This ceasefire is essential for halting further escalation and creating the environment for a genuine and comprehensive peace process. Madam President, the humanitarian dimension of the crisis in Yemen is critical. Approximately 24 million people in Yemen, about 80% of the population, require humanitarian assistance, marking one of the highest proportions of a population in need globally. This already dire situation is compounded by critical levels of food insecurity, with millions on the brink of famine, a devastated healthcare infrastructure, and reported outbreaks of preventable diseases such as cholera and diphtheria. The conflict has displaced over 4 million people internally, further complicating aid efforts. Despite the severity of the situation, Yemen has often been underrepresented in global media compared to other crises, leading to less public awareness and consequently less funding and aid. We urgently call on the international community to mobilize the necessary resources for the 2024 Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen. Madam President, the military dynamics of this conflict, driven by both internal and external actors, continue to fuel instability. The A3+ condemns all attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for an immediate halt to such actions and urge all parties to adhere to international humanitarian law. A political resolution is non-negotiable. Yemen can only find its way out of this quagmire through dialogue and mutual respect for sovereignty. In this regard, we urge parties to the conflict, as well as other local stakeholders, including civil society, women, and youth groups, to actively participate in ongoing discussions being facilitated by UN Special Envoy. In closing, Madam President, the A3+ reiterates the necessity of a comprehensive approach to resolving the crisis in Yemen. We advocate for sustained humanitarian support, a revitalized political process, and unwavering respect for international humanitarian law. The people of Yemen deserve peace, and the world must not turn a blind eye to their suffering. We stand ready to support all efforts that lead to lasting peace and stability in Yemen and the region. I thank you.
Je remercie la
I
représentante
thank
du
the
Guyana
representative of Guyana and I invite the
de
representative of Ecuador to take the floor.
Gracias.
Thank
Señora
you.
Presidenta, quisiera
Thank you,
agradecer
Madam
al
President. I'd
enviado
like to
especial
thank Special Envoy
a la
Grundberg
subsecretaria Ensuya y a la doctora
and
Najat
Undersecretary
por sus exposiciones
General
y por su
Masuya
trabajo por la
and
paz.
Madam Najat Juman for their
Bienvenida también esta mañana al
briefings, and also
representante
welcome the
permanente de
permanent
Yemen
representative of
a esta
Yemen
reunión.
to this meeting.
Señora Presidenta, debo
Madam
comenzar mi
President, I'd
intervención
like to
expresando la
begin my
condena del
statement by
Ecuador a
expressing
los nuevos
Ecuador's
ataques perpetrados
condemnation
por
of the new
Houthis
attacks
en contra de
perpetrated by the
Israel,
Houthis against
que junto
Israel,
con los ataques
which
a las
together with the
embarcaciones en
attacks
el
on
Mar Rojo
shipping in the Red Sea
expanden el
are
conflicto en el
expanding
Medio
the
Oriente
conflict in the
y
Middle East
amenazan la
and
estabilidad de la
threatening
región.
stability in the region.
Mi delegación toma
My
nota del
delegation
anuncio de
takes note
Israel
of the
de
announcement
que
by
sus ataques
Israel
aéreos
that
a los
its
puertos de
aerial
Hodeida
attacks on the
y
ports
Ras
of
Issa
Hodeida and
fueron una
Ras
respuesta al
Issa
ataque
were
de
in
los
response
Houthis
to the
e
Houthi
insta a sus
attacks, and we
autoridades
call
a
upon
respetar el derecho
the authorities to
internacional
respect
y el derecho
international law
internacional
and international
humanitario,
humanitarian
cumpliendo
law,
con los criterios de
complying with the
necesidad,
criteria of
distinción y
necessity,
proporcionalidad.
distinction and proportionality.
El hecho de que los Houthis
The
hayan
fact that the
expresado
Houthis
que
have
no cesarán en
expressed
sus
that
ataques
they
es
will not
preocupante,
cease their attacks is
precisamente por el círculo
concerning,
vicioso
particularly due to
de
the
represalias
vicious
que esto ha
cycle
generado.
of reprisals that this
El
has
Ecuador se
generated.
suma a los llamados
Ecuador
a
joins
que
in
se
the
ejerza la
calls
máxima
for
moderación
maximum
a fin de
restraint
evitar
to
una
be
nueva
shown in
escalada.
order to avoid a new
Estas
escalation.
difíciles
These difficult
circunstancias también han
circumstances
tenido un impacto
have also
negativo
had a
en Yemen,
negative impact on
a
Yemen,
pesar de que los niveles de violencia
despite the fact that the
continúan
levels
siendo
of
inferiores
violence
al periodo
continue to be
anterior
lower
al de
than
la
they were
tregua
in the
alcanzada en
period
2022.
prior to the
Los
truce
choques
achieved in
armados entre los
2022.
distintos
The
bandos
armed clashes
son
between
un
the various
recordatorio
factions are a reminder
de que un
that a
retorno a la
return
guerra
to
sigue siendo
war
presente.
continues to be
Por ello,
present.
es indispensable
That's why
mantener
it's
el apoyo
indispensable to
regional e
maintain
internacional
regional and
a los
international
esfuerzos de
support for
mediación
the
del enviado especial
mediation
Grundberg
efforts of
a efectos de
Special Envoy
generar un entorno
Grundberg in
propicio
order
para un diálogo
to generate
constructivo
an
que
environment
permita
that
retomar
is
el camino
will
hacia un
make
proceso de
constructive
paz.
dialogue
Y en
possible
esa línea,
to resume the
el
path
Ecuador
towards
quiere
peace.
apoyar
And
todas
here
las
we would like to
actividades
support all
que
of
se
the
llevan a cabo con
activities
el
that
objetivo de
are carried out
fortalecer
with
la
the aim
participación
of strengthening
significativa
the
de las
meaningful
mujeres en el
participation
proceso de
of
paz
women in
de
the
acuerdo con la
peace
resolución
process in accordance
1325.
with Resolution
Colegas,
1325.
la crisis
Colleagues,
humanitaria en Yemen se ha
the
deteriorado como
humanitarian crisis
resultado
in
del
Yemen
incremento de los
has
niveles de
worsened
inseguridad alimentaria
due
y
to
la
the
expansión del brote de
increasing
cólera,
levels of
especialmente
food
en la costa
insecurity and the
occidental.
outbreak of cholera, in
A ello se
particular on the
suman las
west
lluvias
coast.
estacionales
To this,
que
there
han
are
causado
seasonal
daños y
rains that have
desplazamientos
caused
en todo el
damage and
país,
displacement throughout the
afectando a más
country,
de 500,000
affecting more
personas
than
desde julio del
500,000
2024.
people since July
Las mujeres y
2024.
niñas que
Women
ya se
and
encuentran
children
entre los grupos más
are amongst
vulnerables
these most
se
vulnerable
enfrentan a
groups,
riesgos
and
cada
they
vez
are
mayores,
facing ever
en
greater
particular los
risk, in
hogares
particular
desplazados
the
encabezados por
displaced
mujeres
families that are led
que
by
representan
women,
más del
which represent more than
22% de las personas
22%
que
of
reciben
those
ayuda de
receiving
emergencia.
emergency assistance.
En este escenario, la prestación
In
de
this
ayuda a
scenario,
los
the
más
provision
necesitados
of
es un
aid to
imperativo
those that
humanitario
need it
que
the most is a
requiere de un entorno
humanitarian
operativo
imperative
que
that requires an
garantice
operative
condiciones de
environment
seguridad
that
y
will
acceso.
guarantee
El
safe
personal
access
humanitario
conditions.
arbitrariamente detenido por
Humanitarian
Houthis
staff
debe ser liberado de manera
arbitrarily
inmediata y
detained by the
incondicional.
Houthis must be released immediately and
Los reportes sobre
unconditionally.
la posible
Reports on the possible
presentación de
bringing
cargos
of charges
en su
against
contra
them
es
is
inaceptable
unacceptable
y agrava aún más la
and
prolongada
further
detención que ya han
worsens the
soportado.
prolonged detention that
Para
they have had to
finalizar,
endure.
debemos
In
lamentar el
conclusion,
trágico
we
incidente
lament the
ocurrido hace
tragic
pocos días
incident
en
that
la
occurred
costa
a
de
few days
Obok,
ago on the coast
en
of
el que al
Obok,
menos
where
45
45
migrantes
migrants
murieron al
at
ser
least
obligados
lost
por
their lives,
traficantes a
having been forced by
abandonarles su
traffickers to
embarcación.
abandon their vessel.
Este tipo de tragedias
These kinds of tragedies
evidencian la urgente necesidad
show the urgent
de
need
proteger a los
to
migrantes
protect
a lo largo de la
migrants
ruta
along the
oriental
entire
desde el
eastern
Cuerno de
route from the
África
Horn of
hasta
Africa
Yemen y
to
el
Yemen and the
Golfo.
Gulf. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le
I
représentant
thank
de
the
l'Équateur et
representative
j'invite la
of Ecuador
représentante
and
de
I
la
invite the
France à prendre la
representative
parole.
of France to take the floor.
Merci Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie
I would like to thank Hans
Joyce
Grundberg,
Moussa
Joyce
et Madame
Masuya
Juman
and
pour leurs
Madam
exposés.
Juman for their briefings.
Je voudrais également
I
saluer
would
la
also like
présence
to
parmi nous du
welcome amongst
représentant
us
permanent du
the
Yémen.
permanent representative
Madame la
of Yemen.
Présidente,
Madam President,
France déplore
France
que les
deplores
Houthis,
the fact that the
soutenus par
Houthis,
l'Iran,
supported by
continuent
Iran, continue to
déstabiliser la mer
destabilize
Rouge
the
par
Red
leurs
Sea
attaques
with
contre
their
les navires
attacks
commerciaux,
against commercial
malgré la
shipping,
résolution
in spite of
2722 et la
resolutions
résolution
2722 and
2739 adoptées par
2739
ce
adopted
Conseil.
by this Council. possible.
Les États ont le droit de
States have the
défendre
right
leurs
to
navires
defend
contre ces
their
attaques
vessels
en
against these
accord avec le
attacks
droit
in accordance with
international.
international law.
Les Houthis doivent
The
cesser
Houthis must
immédiatement
immediately
leurs activités
cease their
déstabilisatrices en mer Rouge.
destabilizing activities in
Nous
the Red
appelons à
Sea.
libérer
We call call
immédiatement
for
le
the
Galaxy
immediate
Leader et son
release of the
équipage
Galaxy
retenus
Leader and
depuis
its
novembre
crew detained
2023.
since November 2023.
La France condamne par ailleurs
France
fermement
also
les attaques
firmly
menées par
condemns the
les
attacks
Houthis
carried out
contre
by the
Israël.
Houthis against
Ces
Israel.
actions
These
alimentent
actions
l'escalade
stoke
dans la région dans
escalation in
laquelle
the
les Houthis
region,
portent une lourde
for
responsabilité.
which the Houthis bear a large
La
part of
France
the
réitère son
responsibility.
attachement à la
France
stabilité régionale et
recalls
à la
its
sécurité de
attachment
ses
to regional
partenaires dans la
stability
région.
and support of
Elle
our partners
poursuivra
in the
son
region.
engagement
We
dans
will
le cadre de
continue
l'opération
our
défensive et
work as part of the
politique de sécurité
European
de défense de
Union
l'Union
Defence
européenne
and Security
ASPIDES
Operation as
pour
Speeders
protéger la sûreté
to
maritime
protect
et la
maritime
liberté de
safety and the
navigation
freedom of navigation
conformément au droit
in accordance with
international
international
et en
law
lien avec ses
and
partenaires.
working together with our partners.
Madame la
Madam
Présidente,
President,
la France condamne de nouveau la
France once
détention
again
arbitraire
condemns
des
the
personnels des
arbitrary
Nations Unies
detention
et
of
d'ONG
United
locales
Nations
et
staff and staff
internationales.
of local and
Elle
international
exige leur
NGOs.
libération
We demand their
immédiate.
immediate
Nous
release.
sommes
We are
extrêmement
extremely
préoccupés par les
concerned that the
conséquences de ces détentions
consequences
sur les
that these
opérations
detentions will have on
humanitaires,
humanitarian
ainsi que par les
operations,
accusations qui
as
sont
well
portées
as
contre les
the
personnes
charges
détenues.
brought against
Ces
those
détentions,
detained.
contraires au
These
droit
detentions
international
are contrary to
humanitaire,
international
entravent l'acheminement de
humanitarian
l'aide
law
et
and
la
are
réponse
hindering
d'urgence,
the
en particulier
humanitarian
face à
emergency
l'épidémie de choléra.
response, particularly given the outbreak of
Nous appelons les
cholera.
Houthis
We
à
call
tout
upon the
mettre en œuvre
Houthis
pour
to do everything
permettre aux
possible
acteurs
to make
humanitaires
it
de
possible
vacciner les
for
populations
humanitarian
les plus
actors to
vulnérables
vaccinate
et à
the most
mettre fin
vulnerable
aux
populations
campagnes
and
de
put an end to the
désinformation qui
campaigns
sont
of
orchestrées
disinformation that
contre
are
ces
being
acteurs
orchestrated
humanitaires.
against these humanitarian workers.
Nous sommes inquiets des projections
We are concerned
dramatiques
about the
pour
dramatic
2025 en matière
projections
de
for
besoins
2025
humanitaires
with regard to
qui ne cessent
humanitarian needs
d'augmenter.
that continue to
L'insécurité
increase.
alimentaire touche
Food
désormais toutes
insecurity
les régions
is
du
now
Yémen.
affecting all regions
Les
of
Houthis
Yemen.
doivent cesser de
The
prendre en
Houthis
otage les
must stop
populations civiles
taking
yéménites.
the Yemeni
Les
civilian
Yéménites sont
population
les premières
hostage.
victimes des
The
restrictions
Yemenis are the
qu'ils
first
imposent
victims
aux
of the
opérations
restrictions that they
humanitaires.
impose on
La
humanitarian
France appelle
operations.
à garantir un
France
accès
calls
humanitaire
for
sûr et
safe
sans
and
entrave.
unimpeded
La
humanitarian
communauté
access.
internationale doit
The
rester
international
mobilisée
community
pour
must
répondre
remain
aux besoins des
mobilized to
populations
respond to
civiles.
the needs of the civilian population.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
le
President,
contexte régional ne
the
doit pas nous
regional
faire perdre de
context
vue
must not
l'importance qui
make
demeure
us lose
de
sight of
reprendre
the
les
importance
négociations
of a
de paix sous
resumption of
l'égide
peace
de l'envoyé
negotiations
spécial
under the
Grundberg,
aegis of Special
auquel la France
Representative
réitère son
Grundberg,
plein soutien,
and France
notamment
reiterates
dans
our
la
full
mise en
support
œuvre de
to
sa
him,
feuille de
particularly
route
in the
politique.
implementation of
C'est
his
la seule
political
solution pour
roadmap.
parvenir à
This
une
is the only
cessation
solution
complète
that
et durable
will
des
lead to a
hostilités.
complete and
Les
lasting
Houthis doivent
cessation of
revenir
hostilities.
à la
The
table des
Houthis must come
négociations
back to the
conduites par
table of
l'envoyé spécial.
negotiations
La
conducted by
France
the
souligne
Special Envoy.
l'importance d'avoir des
France stresses the
négociations
importance
inclusives
of having
qui
inclusive
garantissent la
negotiations that will guarantee the
de la
participation of civil
société civile et
society
des femmes
and
yéménites.
Yemeni women.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you.
Je remercie la
I
représentante de
thank
la
the
France
representative
et
of
je passe la
France, and I
parole
now
au
give the floor to
représentant
the
des
representative
États-Unis.
of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grundberg, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, and Ms. Juman for your briefings. Last week, we marked a solemn milestone, 1 year since Hamas's brutal October 7 terrorist attack on Israel. This week, we mark yet another grim anniversary, 1 year since the Houthis, seeking to exploit this devastation, launched cruise missiles and drones at Israel. Much has changed in the months since, and yet the Houthis continue to sow chaos and disruption, threatening international peace and security. Over the last year, the Houthis have taken the lives of innocent seafarers and disrupted essential imports to regional populations. They have boasted about their increasingly sophisticated weapons, which not only cause significant damage to passing ships, but threaten environmental disaster. And a few weeks ago, just hours after Israel eliminated the leader of Hezbollah, the Houthis fired a salvo of ballistic missiles at civilian infrastructure in Israel, including Ben Gurion International Airport. The Houthis are not acting alone. There is verifiable evidence they have been receiving weapons and military supplies from Iran in violation of the UN arms embargo. And there are alarming public reports. A permanent member of this council considered providing the Houthis with supersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles and may be negotiating to give them small arms. And so, it has never been more important to enforce the arms embargo established under Resolution 2216. Put simply, violators should know there will be costs to supplying arms to the Houthis. In addition, this Council should take steps to strengthen the UN verification and inspection mechanism. This mechanism is critical to stanching the flow of weapons to the Houthis. And yet, right now, it is hamstrung by funding gaps and personnel shortfalls. For our part, the United States has provided
$1 million to UNVIM in 2024, and we have approached many capitals to request additional contribution to its 2025 budget with no restrictions. Now is the time for everyone to step up and provide the funds needed for UNVIM to hire additional monitors and fulfill its mission. Because frankly, it needs to fulfill its mission. This mechanism isn't perfect, but it is a way to ensure arms and related materiel are not illicitly smuggled to the Houthis by Iran or any other malign actor. Of course, the instability is hardly restricted to the Red Sea. Inside Yemen, we continue to see rampant injustice. Humanitarians, along with UN and embassy personnel, have been abducted. And we are extremely concerned the Houthis have reportedly started referring detainees to their so-called state security court, known for its use of video-recorded forced confessions, among other abuses. Let me be clear. No judicial process in the Houthis' hands has a shred of legitimacy. And we repeat our demand for the immediate release of those being held. Given these developments, the United States stands firm in our belief that the UN and international community cannot continue business as usual. The time has come for the UN to adjust its non-life-saving, non-life-sustaining programming and operations in Yemen to ensure the safety and security of all personnel. We were glad to see Acting Undersecretary General Masuya call for this recalibration last month. Now, the UN country team and its agencies in the field must take immediate action to implement it. Colleagues, the Yemeni people aspire for a freer, fairer, more prosperous future, for a country that respects their human rights and upholds their fundamental freedoms. Let us stand for a Yemeni political process that leads to a durable end to this conflict. And let us stand by the Yemeni people as they call for justice, accountability, and peace. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant des
I thank the
États-Unis et
representative
je
of the
passe la
United
parole
States
au
and I give the floor
représentant de
to
la
the
Slovénie.
representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank Special Envoy, Mr. Grundberg, Acting Undersecretary General, Masuya, as well as Dr. Juman for their briefings today, and I welcome Ambassador of Yemen in the chamber. Madam President, recent weeks have seen a dangerous escalation in the region, from which Yemen is regrettably not immune. We condemn the latest spiral of violence, which has seen Houthis attacks against Tel Aviv and Ashkelon, as well as renewed Israeli strikes against Hodeidah and Rasisa ports. We reiterate that attacks against civilian infrastructure and objects are prohibited under international law. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to do the utmost to contain the escalation and avoid embroiling Yemen further in the crisis. A dangerous and unending tit-for-tat is not in anyone's interest. In particular, we call on Houthis to focus on the needs and aspirations of Yemeni people first and foremost. We urge all Yemeni actors to display courage and determination to refocus efforts on an inclusive Yemeni peace process and the Special Envoy's roadmap. Dialogue can be the only way forward. Meanwhile, Madam President, the humanitarian needs of Yemenis on the ground are not subsiding, as we have just heard from the briefers. And the situation for humanitarians operating in Yemen continues to be extremely precarious. More than 100 days have passed since the detention by the Houthis of UN staff and other humanitarian and NGO workers. This is unacceptable, and we reiterate our calls for their immediate and unconditional release. We stress that UN personnel enjoy immunity from detention and that UN premises are inviolable. Slovenia is also concerned by the potential humanitarian impact of developments in the Red Sea and Yemen's western ports, whether they be unrelenting Houthis attacks against commercial shipping, which risk environmental catastrophe, or strikes against Hodeidah and Rasisa. It is vital that crucial waterways and port infrastructure remain open and functioning particularly given Yemen's heavy reliance on imports. And while needs are soaring across the region, we urge donors to continue to prioritize Yemen's humanitarian crisis and the life-saving and life-sustaining work that OCHA and other humanitarian actors are carrying out on the ground across the country. Before concluding, I want to take the opportunity to highlight the plight of Yemeni children following a decade of brutal conflict. From recruitment to early marriage to facing increasing protection risks as a result of displacement and the highest risk from landmines and unexploding ordnance. Yemeni children continue to suffer the brunt of the war which they have played no part in creating. It is deeply distressing that while almost 40% of Yemen's children are now out of school and denied a regular education, others face indoctrination in Houthi summer camps, perpetuating an unending cycle of violence. Madam President, last month we adopted the Pact for the Future, including a declaration on future generations. All parties in Yemen must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian human rights law. This includes their obligations to the protection of Yemen's children. Otherwise, we risk losing an entire future generation. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie et je passe la parole à la représentante du Japon.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Grundberg and ASG Musuya for their informative briefings. My appreciation also goes to Dr. Juman on her sobering testimony. Yemen is at the brink. The country has been bearing hostilities, fragmentation, and a humanitarian crisis for a decade. And now it faces an increasing risk of being dragged into a wider regional conflict. We must halt the downward spiral as soon as possible. I wish to highlight 3 points for today's briefing. First, Japan strongly condemns the series of irresponsible conducts by the Houthis. The Houthis' reckless attacks towards Israel and aggravate the already dangerous situation in the Middle East. This must stop immediately. The Houthis must also cease their continued threats to international shipping and release the vessels and the crew members of the Galaxy Reader in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2722 and 2739. Since last year, global maritime transportation has been significantly disrupted, and the 25 innocent sailors have been held captive for nearly 330 days. This is totally unacceptable. The arbitrary detention of UN staff members and others for more than 4 months and judicial accusation is outrageous. These individuals were serving for the benefit of Yemens. Detaining them only impedes critical humanitarian assistance and human rights protection activities and worsens the dire situation in the country. Japan reiterates its demand for their immediate and unconditional release, as well as the release of those held in captivity for years. We also reject any criminal prosecutions against them. Second, Japan deeply regrets that the peace process has stalled amid regional escalation. This has led to growing insecurity and instability in Yemen. It is our firm belief that only a sustainable and inclusive dialogue among all Yemens, not violence or hatred, will pave the way for lasting peace in the country. We are encouraged to hear from Special Envoy that peace in Yemen is achievable. Japan continues to support his efforts to restore momentum and facilitate peace talks between the parties. Third, Japan remains seriously concerned about persisting food insecurity, diseases, and natural disasters in Yemen. The international community must scale up assistance to save over 18 million people suffering from the multifaceted humanitarian crisis. their livelihoods heavily depend upon imports. To this end, last month, Japan committed to grant nearly $5 million to UNDP for a project to streamline the imports of food, humanitarian aid, and other goods at the port of Aden, an essential maritime facility in Yemen. Japan remains steadfast in working to realize peace and stability in Yemen in cooperation with the United Nations and fellow countries. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie la représentante du Japon et je passe la parole au représentant de Malte.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank Special Envoy Grundberg, Acting Under Secretary General Msuya, and Professor Jaman for their briefings. I also welcome the Permanent Representative of Yemen to the Chamber today. Malta remains deeply concerned by the escalating tensions in the region, which continue to hamper progress towards peace in Yemen. For nearly a decade, the Yemeni people have suffered this protracted conflict. This translates into millions of people experiencing acute food insecurity, with some districts facing critical levels of malnutrition. Thousands of children are estimated to be acutely malnourished by the end of 2024. Millions of people have been internally displaced, many of them multiple times. They are suffering lack of water, healthcare, and sanitation services. Hundreds of migrants have lost their lives this year, making 2024 the deadliest year for migrant sea crossings between the Horn of Africa and Yemen. Preventable diseases like cholera continue to spread rapidly. These are aggravated by heavy seasonal rains affecting Yemen's fragile water and sanitation systems. The international community must act now to prevent greater suffering and loss of life. It must urgently scale up financial support to Yemen's humanitarian response plan, which remains underfunded. Despite the emergency, impediments to the delivery of humanitarian aid persist. We demand that movement restrictions on women be lifted to facilitate humanitarian access throughout the country. Malta condemns the arbitrary detention by the Houthis of UN personnel, staff from non-governmental organizations, and civil society representatives. We echo the Secretary General's demand for their immediate and unconditional release. These detentions are unprecedented and directly impede the delivery of humanitarian aid and protection to the 18.2 million people in need. We stress that while they are detained, they must be treated with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. This includes allowing them to contact their families and legal representatives. Madam President, as we have heard today from Professor Jaman, the economic situation for most Yemenis continues to decline. It remains a large driver of suffering. The effects of natural disasters and climate change also add to the challenges, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. Yemen's economy must be depoliticized. We call on all parties to engage in dialogue and collaborate on the economic front to strengthen the country's currency and economy. We urge parties to return to the negotiating table to engage on commitments made to the UN roadmap. They need to focus on agreeing to a nationwide ceasefire and the resumption of an inclusive, Yemeni-led and owned political process under UN auspices. We reiterate that any inclusive political process requires the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women. We urge the UN and member states facilitating talks to put in place enhanced and targeted measures to achieve the 30% quota agreed in the National Dialogue Conference. Madam President, we condemn the Houthis' missile and drone attacks against Israel, as well as their continued attacks against vessels in the Red Sea. We are also very concerned by Israel's retaliatory attacks in Yemen that have led to loss of life and damaged critical infrastructure. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, as further escalation of conflict will only exacerbate and prolong the suffering of the most vulnerable. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de Malte et je passe la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you. Thank you, President. My appreciation goes to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg, OCHA Acting USG Joyce Msuya, Dr. Najat Juman for their briefing. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Yemen. The Middle East is facing a grave escalation of conflicts. The situation in Yemen is also deteriorating and compounding the pain of Yemeni people. Indeed, the region is ablaze with multiple crises that could further escalate into a wider regional war, particularly if these multi-front fires ignite simultaneously. The Houthis' ongoing attacks against vessels in the Red Sea and missile and drone strikes targeting Israel, along with cooperation with so-called axis of resistance, risk pouring more fuel on the regional fire. At this pivotal moment, I wish to make the following points. First, we urge all UN member states, including neighboring countries, to fully implement all relevant Security Council resolutions, including the targeted arms embargo. The final report of the panel of experts shows the unprecedented scale and nature of military material transfers, including financial support and training, in violation of Resolution 2216. It serves as a stark reminder of the urgent need for stricter compliance with the Security Council resolutions. Second, we express our deep concerns over the recent alarming developments regarding Houthis' referral to criminal prosecution of those arbitrarily detained in Yemen, including 3 UN personnel. These measures are all the more astonishing as they further undermine the critical international assistance for the sake of the long-suffering Yemeni people. We strongly support the press release issued by the principals of affected UN entities and international NGOs last weekend and unequivocally call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees. Third, the worsening economic crisis due to flooding and financial sector disorder undercuts efforts to foster meaningful dialogue. Arbitrary economic measures and tit-for-tat countermeasures between the Houthis and the government of Yemen will only aggravate humanitarian crisis for Yemenis. It is regrettable there has been no new positive developments based on the economic de-escalation agreement in July. We call on the Houthis to refrain from additional hostile economic measures and to engage with the Yemeni government to move forward in tackling economic challenges. President, the Republic of Korea is fully committed to supporting Yemen's path to durable peace and reaffirms its unwavering support for the efforts of Special Envoy Hans Grundberg, humanitarian workers, and OCHA. Kickstarting the stalled political process under the auspices of the United Nations is long overdue. To do so, parties must prioritize ending violence and conflict to turn a new leaf for Yemen's future. And in particular, the Houthis should not utilize the Gaza crisis as an excuse for its belligerent actions. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée et j'invite le représentant de la Chine à prendre la parole.
China.
主席，
President,
我要感谢格伦
I
德
wish
伯
to
格特
thank
使
Special Envoy
和米
Grundberg
苏亚
and
代理
Acting
秘书长的
USG
通报。
Misuya for their briefings.
我也认真听取了
I've
朱曼
also
女士的
listened
发言，
attentively to Ms.
也欢迎
Juman's
也门代表
statement.
出席今天
I
的会议。
welcome the presence of the representative of Yemen at today's
过去几
meeting.
周，加沙冲
In
突
the
持
past
续
few
延宕
weeks, the，
离异
protracted
局势
conflict
急
in
剧恶
Gaza
化，
and the rapidly
负面外
deteriorating
溢效应
situation
不
between
断显
Lebanon and
现。
Israel have further
不再武装
intensified the
加
negative spillover
对以
effects.
色列发动打
The
击，
Houthis
以
launched
色列对
attacks
荷
on
台达
Israel,
港、
while
拉
Israel
斯伊萨
launched
港发动
airstrikes
攻
on the
击。
ports of Hodeidah and
中方
Ras
对当
Isa.
前事态及其
China
未
is
来走
deeply
向
worried about the
深感
current
担忧，
situation and its future
认为当务之
trajectory.
急是推
We
动局势
believe
降
that the
温，
top
防
priority
止
is to
冲突
push
扩
for
大
the。 de-escalation of the situation
我
and
们
to
呼吁所有
prevent the
当事
widening
方
of the conflict.
保
We
持
call
冷
on
静
all parties
克
concerned
制，
to keep calm, remain
避免
restrained,
采取任何
and
刺激紧
refrain
张
from
局
any
势、
action
进
that
一
will
步升
further
级的行动。
escalate tension.
Dialogue
and consultation are the only correct choice to resolve the issue of Yemen. We call on all parties concerned to stay committed to the general direction of political settlement, resolve differences through dialogue and consultation, and jointly promote a Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned comprehensive political process. All parties should act in good faith, jointly advance the implementation of the agreements on banking and aviation issues, and gradually accumulate mutual trust. Special Envoy Grundberg has made positive mediation efforts to resolve the Yemeni issue. China appreciates this and calls on all parties to support the work of the Special Envoy in order to make tangible progress in the political settlement of the Yemeni issue as soon as possible. The continuing tension in the Red Sea does not serve the common interests of the international community. China once again calls on the Houthis to respect the right of navigation of commercial ships of all countries in the Red Sea in accordance with international law and to cease the attacks in order to maintain the safety of waterways in the Red Sea. All parties concerned should remain calm and exercise restraint and stop actions that exacerbate tensions. China is deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Yemen and calls on the international community to increase its humanitarian and development imports in Yemen and strengthen its support to the Yemeni government to improve people's livelihoods. China is gravely concerned about the detention of UN personnel in Yemen. We note that the Houthis has allowed some of the detained to contact the outside. We encourage all parties to strengthen communication to facilitate the unconditional release of all UN personnel as soon as possible. President, the situation in Yemen is closely linked to the situation in the Middle East. The year-long conflict in Gaza has already caused an unprecedented humanitarian disaster and is increasingly dragging the entire region into the quagmire of war and conflict. At this critical moment, the situation must not be allowed to deteriorate further and go down a road of no return. The Security Council must remain united and take measures to stop reckless military adventures in disregard of the consequences that widen the conflagration. We should push for the permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the escalation of the tension between Lebanon and Israel to avoid a bigger catastrophe in the Middle East. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that China is ready to work with the international community to continue to make unremitting efforts for political solution to the Yemeni issue and for the maintenance of peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President. Je remercie le représentant de la Chine et j'invite le représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Madam President,
признательны
we'd like
спецпосланнику
to thank the
Хансу
Special
Гринбергу
Envoy
и
Hans
исполняющему
Grundberg
обязанности
and the
заместителя
acting
генерального секретаря ООН по
Undersecretary
гуманитарным
General for
вопросам
Humanitarian
Джой
Affairs,
Суе
Ms.
за
Joyce Msuya. We
представленные
thank
доклады.
them for their briefings.
Внимательно выслушали также
We
профессора
also
Джумана.
listened very carefully to the statement made by Professor Juman.
Госпожа председатель, градус
Madam President,
напряженности в
the
Йемене не
level of
спадает.
tension in Yemen
Более
is
того,
not going
обстановка
down.
имеет тенденцию
Moreover,
к
the situation
обострению.
tends to worsen.
Из-за все большего втягивания
Yemen is
более
being
широкий
increasingly
региональный
dragged
конфликт
into
на фоне
wider regional
продолжающегося
conflict against
насилия
a
в секторе
background of
Газа,
continued violence
Ливане и
in
других
Gaza,
местах на
Lebanon,
Ближнем Востоке.
and other areas in the Middle East.
Подчеркиваю
We would like
неизменность
to
позиции
underscore
России
the constant
относительно
position
поддержки
Russia has
безопасности
had. We
международного судоходства в
support
Красном море,
the safety of
Аденском
international
заливе и
navigation in
остальных
the Red
акваториях.
Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and other seas.
Выступаем за то, чтобы
We think that
Ансар
Ansar
Аллах
Allah
прекратила
should
любые
stop
действия,
any
препятствующие
actions
свободе
which
навигации,
impede the freedom of
представляющие опасность для
navigation, which
коммерческих
present
судов,
a danger for
включая топливные
commercial vessels,
Призываем
including
немедленно
oil
освободить
tankers,
судно
and we
Galaxy
call
Leader
for an
и его
immediate
экипаж.
release of the Galaxy Leader and its crew.
Однако убеждены,
But
что
we
для
are
реальной
convinced
стабилизации
that
обстановки
in order
в
to
близлежащих
really
к Йемену
stabilize the
акваториях
situation in
не
the
меньшее
seas
давление
of the
следует
coast of
оказывать
Yemen,
на
what
участников
needs to
так
happen
называемой
is equal
коалиции во
pressure
главе с Соединенными
exerted on the
Штатами
members of the
Великобритании,
so-called coalition led by the United
продолжающими
States and the
еженедельно
UK, who
весьма
continue
неизбирательно
weekly
атаковать
and quite
территорию этой суверенной
indiscriminately
страны
attacking
в
territory
нарушение
of this
норм
sovereign
международного
country
права.
in violation of international law.
Осуществление ими подобной
This
подрывной деятельности наводит на
destabilizing
мысль о реальных
activity
мотивах,
by
которые,
them
очевидно, явно далеки
leads us to
от
the
достижения
thinking of their
подлинного
real
урегулирования
reasons,
Йемена
which are very
в
far
рамках
within
имеющихся
from attaining the genuine settlement in Yemen within the existing parameters. But this is a similar pattern that our Western partners also use in other countries and regions. We would like to underscore that striking Yemen is unacceptable. At the same time, we want to say that destroying its port infrastructure could have the most dire humanitarian consequences. All of those who watch the region see very clear that what would help stabilizing the situation in the Red Sea would be first and foremost by ending the aggressive military campaign by Israel in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. Madam President, regardless of the prospects for the settlement of the Middle East as a whole, we think it's important to continue the active political and diplomatic work with the political forces in Yemen. Alongside strengthening the recent progress in resolving the internal differences in the economic area in Yemen, we need to continue advancing towards finalizing our work on the roadmap for the political process in the country. We note it's important to make sure there's alignment between the international efforts and regional actors when they're aimed at helping parties to the conflict come together. Furthermore, what remains relevant is renewing the legal basis for the Yemeni settlement so as to reflect the realities on the ground. In order to resolve these and other issues, we intend to continue very closely coordinating our approaches with all Yemeni actors, including Ansar Allah, call upon them to find mutually acceptable solutions and build trust. We're also ready to continue supporting the Special Envoy Grundberg. We had consultations with him in Moscow last week. Madam President, unfortunately, the very difficult humanitarian and socioeconomic situation in the country continues. Two-thirds of the population need humanitarian assistance. More than 3 million people do not have enough food. We think that the international community and donors should prioritize this issue. We note the mediation work done by regional actors who are already helping Yemenis in the financial and humanitarian tracks. The people of this long-suffering countries should have unimpeded access to foodstuffs, medicines, and other essential goods, regardless of where they live. Any restrictions on humanitarian supplies and impeding the work of humanitarians are unacceptable. We'd like to express our concern having to do with the detention by Ansar Allah of the local UN staff. We'd like to recall in this context of the privileges and immunities by UN staff. Such steps have a negative impact on the UN and humanitarian work in the country, and this is something that, of course, hits the ordinary people first and foremost. At the same time, double standards should be avoided. Some Western countries desire to sound an alarm when it comes to the UN personnel issues in Yemen are in stark contrast with their reaction, or rather almost total absence of reaction when it comes to the death of UN staff in Gaza as a result of Israeli strikes, and when it comes to the onslaught of the IDF against the interim forces in Lebanon, who nonetheless continue discharging their duty. It is important to expand this principal position by our Western colleagues to UNRWA, which the Israeli authorities are trying to force out of the Palestinian territory, and we call on all Council members to not allow such egregious and blatant double standards. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie et je me permets de faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la Suisse. Je voudrais, comme mes collègues, remercier l'envoyé spécial Hans Grundberg, la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires ad interim Joyce Msuya et l'économiste Najat Juman de leurs interventions. Je salue aussi la participation du représentant permanent du Yémen. Si la paix n'a pas de prix, la guerre, elle, par contre, a un coût au Yémen. Le PIB s'est effondré de moitié en 10 ans de conflit. Destruction des infrastructures, fuite des cerveaux et des capitaux, impact sur la circulation des personnes et des marchandises, division des institutions économiques, instauration d'une économie de guerre et mesures de rétorsion économique. Comme l'a souligné la professeure Najat Juman, les répercussions du conflit sur l'économie se manifestent sous de multiples formes et
un constat demeure. C'est la population civile qui en fait les frais. Aujourd'hui, les Yéménites sont confrontés à une situation économique et humanitaire extrêmement difficile. 4 Yéménites sur 5 vivent dans la pauvreté. Plus de 18 millions de personnes ont besoin d'une aide humanitaire pour répondre aux besoins de base tels que l'accès aux soins ou à la nourriture. La prolongation du conflit dans le domaine économique perturbe l'approvisionnement et le transport des marchandises, générant une dynamique inflationniste artificielle. Cette situation exacerbe l'insécurité alimentaire, déjà alarmante, avec 64% de la population n'ayant pas accès à une nourriture suffisante. Malgré ces besoins aigus, les acteurs et actrices humanitaires doivent opérer dans un environnement difficile. Nous restons très préoccupés par la détention arbitraire d'une partie du personnel humanitaire et onusien. Le lancement de procédures pénales à leur encontre, dont fait état certains rapports, est un développement inquiétant. La Suisse réitère l'appel de l'ONU, déjà entendu plusieurs fois aujourd'hui et de manière constante ces derniers mois. Le personnel humanitaire et onusien détenu doit être libéré immédiatement et sans condition. De plus, l'accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave doit être garanti sur l'ensemble du territoire. Comme l'a justement constaté Mme Najat Jouman, dans cette situation déjà précaire, le Yémen ne peut pas se permettre d'être entraîné dans une guerre régionale. À ce titre, les différentes frappes rapportées ces dernières semaines nous préoccupent profondément. Nous condamnons cette escalade de violence. Le droit international, y compris le droit international humanitaire, en particulier les principes de proportionnalité, de distinction et de précaution, doivent impérativement être respectés par toutes les parties. Les infrastructures civiles ne doivent pas être prises pour cible. À ce titre, nous souhaitons rappeler l'importance du port de Hodeïda, qui reste le point d'entrée principal de l'aide humanitaire pour une grande partie du Yémen. Nous exhortons toutes les parties à renoncer à toute escalade. Le dialogue est la seule option. Nous l'avons entendu, seule une solution politique permettra de soulager la population yéménite de l'impact économique et humanitaire du conflit. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties avec de l'influence
parties with influence, including within this council, to commit themselves to such a solution and for human rights in Yemen to be respected. In this regard, Switzerland notes the tireless work of Special Envoy Grundberg and his team. We reiterate our full support for him. We also welcome his efforts to implement the agreement on the economic sector concluded last July, which we call for to be fully respected. Switzerland welcomes the unity of the Council in favour of a peace process in Yemen under the aegis of the Special Envoy, which has prevailed since the beginning of the conflict. We must continue our unwavering commitment in this direction. After all, nothing is more precious than peace. Thank you.
Je reprends mes fonctions de président du Conseil et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Yémen.
Allow me, Madam President, to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Council this month. I thank the permanent representative of the friendly country of Slovenia for his successful presidency last month. I thank the briefers.
تؤكد الحكومة اليمنية مجددا التزامها بنهج السلام الشامل العادل والمستدام وكانت ولا زالت تدعو إلى حياة السلام لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار والتنمية والحياة الطبيعية لليمنيين. ولا تزال تبذل جهودا متفانية للوصول إلى حل سياسي للصراع وفقا للمرجعيات المتفق عليها وهي المبادرة الخليجية للتنفيذية مخرجات مؤتمر الحوار الوطني الشامل قرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة والمقدمة القرار 22 وتجدد حكومة بلادي دعمها لجهود المبعوث الخاص للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة وكافة الجهود الإقليمية والدولية الرامية إلى إنهاء هذا الصراع وتحقيق السلام في اليمن وعلى وجه التحديد جهود الاشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية سلطنة عمان الهادفة إلى الإسهام في التمهيد للحل السياسي ومعالجة الأزمة اليمنية منذ انقلابها على الشرعية الدستورية والتوافق
crisis. Since toppling the constitutional legitimacy and national consensus, Houthi militias have been causing wars, crises, tragedies, and divisions. They have been committing the worst human rights violations. They've been destroying the lives of children by recruiting them and pushing them to the battlefield. They've been planting millions of mines. They've been pursuing the policy of systematic impoverishment and starvation to humiliate and subjugate Yemenis in areas under their control. They've been destroying the national economy, creating a parallel economy to finance their wars. They've been taking the lives of Yemenis. They've been depriving Yemenis of their security, stability, food, their present and their future. They've been destroying the social fabric. They've been hollowing out the education system. They've destroyed health facilities and cultural centers, and they've spread ignorance with all possible ways to alter the national identity. The terrorists, the Houthi militias, have proven once again that they're not committed to peace or the interest of the Yemeni people. The international community have been lax in dealing with these militias, and they've been supported by the Iranian regime. As a result, they evaded their responsibilities in achieving peace. They've continued their military escalation. They've continued with violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, national legislation, and they've continued to threaten international navigation in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which has disastrous effects on the marine environment and the economic and humanitarian situation in Yemen and in countries bordering the Red Sea. In this context, we reiterate the message conveyed by Dr. Rashad Mohammed Al-Halimi, the chairman of the Presidential Leadership Council, in his statement before the General Assembly. I quote, "To avoid an expansion and perpetuation of this escalation, there is an urgent need for a collective approach to support the Yemeni government and enhance its institutional capacities to protect its regional waters and secure its national territories. Without addressing these needs, the militias will not engage with any efforts to achieve peace and will not cease its extortion and will not cease to threaten regional international peace and security." End of quote. The Yemeni government calls upon the international community and this august council to fulfill its responsibility and implement its resolutions pertaining to the Yemeni crisis, including banning the flow of Iranian weapons, drying up financing sources, and bringing pressure to bear on the Houthi militias to choose the path of peace and engage positively with peace efforts and end the humanitarian suffering that has been going on for way too long. Madam President, the Yemeni government continues to work on economic, financial, and administrative reforms to address issues related to the lives and livelihood of Yemenis and to alleviate their suffering within existing resources. The government has continued to implement strict measures to ensure accountability and transparency and combat corruption, increase economic resources, and optimally use foreign aid to respond to the needs and implement government priorities. The aim is to ensure economic stability, ensure the stability of the national currency, despite pressures on the economy and the decline of resources as a result of Houthi militias targeting oil exporting facilities since October 2022 in its continued systematic economic and military wars. The Yemeni government calls upon the international community once again to provide support to address the deteriorating humanitarian and economic situation and lay the foundation for a long-term economic recovery. This includes immediate humanitarian aid to alleviate the suffering and build stronger accountability mechanisms, especially in the areas under the control of the militias. This also includes bigger investments in civilian infrastructure, in health and education, sustainable development, and in enhancing national capacities to mitigate the effects of climate change that led to hundreds of casualties and displaced thousands over the past 2 months. Madam President, Houthi militias continue to obstruct, steal, and divert humanitarian
aid. They are committing the worst violations against humanitarian actions in areas under its control. Most recently, they've kidnapped scores of staff of international and local organizations operating in Yemen, including UN organizations. This was followed by a number of arbitrary and extortive measures against agencies and their staff. 4 months have passed, and these staff members remain detained, forcibly disappeared, in fact. Their families have no information about their whereabouts or their health conditions. 4 months have passed, and these detained people are in secret prisons, subjected to torture, cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. 4 months have passed, and the families of the victims and the humanitarian community as a whole looks to this august council, looks to the United Nations to take decisive action to protect UN staff and save their lives, especially as they were recently referred to the so-called criminal prosecution in preparation for issuing unjust verdicts against them. They would join dozens of others that faced this fate, which is something that we've warned of. It has become urgent to intensify efforts and to increase international pressures to ensure the immediate and unconditional release of the detained and ensure the accountability for these crimes. The Yemeni government calls once again for relocating the headquarters of the UN agencies and headquarters of international organizations operating in Yemen to the temporary capital in Aden to ensure an environment that allows the agencies to work effectively and to serve those in need and to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian workers. In conclusion, Madam President, the patient Yemeni people looks to sustainable peace that fulfills its aspirations, that champions the policy of the state, promoting rights, freedoms, justice, equality, and national partnership, and to enhance democracy, as opposed to the policy of appropriation, marginalization, injustice, and divine selectivity. Peace in Yemen will prevail, and the hopes of Yemenis to regain their country, to achieve peace, security, and development will turn to reality. I thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du Yémen. Il n'y a plus d'orateurs ou d'oratrices inscrits sur la liste. J'invite à présent les membres du Conseil à poursuivre l'examen de la question dans le cadre de consultation. La séance est levée.